Bautista, Policy Manager at the Makati Business Club, and I'd like to welcome you to today's event, Beyond the Numbers, Global Conflict and Local Consequences for the Philippines. This marks the first installment of the MBC Economic Briefing Series for 2026, a series where we go beyond the numbers to bring you not just the latest economic data, but the insights and analysis that matter for decision makers like you. Amid escalating tensions in the Middle East, oh, global energy markets have become increasingly volatile with implications for oil prices, inflation, and broader economic conditions for the Philippines. These developments highlight the importance of understanding how external shocks have impacted the domestic economy. This briefing aims to provide clearer view of these dynamics, drawing from both industry and macroeconomic perspectives. It's a timely, high impact conversation, and we're glad you're here to be part of it. Before we start, may I ask everyone for a group photo? Kindly turn on your cameras and smile.
Okay, so we have three slides in our screen. Please remain smiling. Three, two, one, smile. Okay. Thank you, Bettina. Turning it over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. To formally open today's session, we'd like to call on Ms. Riza Mantaring, one board of trustee of the Makati Business Club, to give opening remarks. Over to you, our GM.
Yeah. Morning, ladies and gentlemen, fellow business leaders, policymakers, and partners in nation building. On behalf of the Makati Business Club, welcome to Beyond the Numbers Global Conflict, Local Consequences for the Philippines. We gather today at a time when the world is once again reminded that distant wars are never truly distant. The escalating conflict involving Iran, the United States, and Israel may be unfolding thousands of kilometers away, but for the Philippines, its consequences are immediate, tangible, and can be felt in our day to day life and expenses. For many Filipinos, geopolitics can feel like a remote concept until its effects trickle down to the gas pump, the grocery shelf, the power bill, or the remittance sent home by a loved one overseas. Today, Brent crude has surged past $100 per barrel amid disruptions in the Strait of Hormuz, a choke point that handles roughly 20% of global oil flows, as you've probably heard over and over again these past weeks. This matters profoundly to the Philippines, a country heavily dependent on imported fuel. Higher oil prices do not simply mean more expensive gasoline, they mean rising transport and logistics costs, more expensive food, elevated electricity prices, inflationary pressure on households, and greater uncertainty for businesses already navigating a fragile global economy. And in the worst case, a fuel shortage could even result in empty shelves in our groceries and markets. But inflated prices are only one part of the story. The Middle East is also home to millions of overseas Filipino workers whose sacrifices sustain families, communities, and our national economy. Around 18% of Philippine remittances come from the broader Middle East region, and any prolonged instability threatens not only jobs abroad, but the resilience of millions of households here at home. Already, 7,000 OFWs are reported to have come home from the Middle East, with 40,000 more stranded here in the Philippines, unable to leave. Beyond the numbers is not only about oil prices, GDP forecasts, or inflation targets. It's about recognizing that behind every percentage point are Filipino workers, entrepreneurs, transport operators, exporters, and families making difficult choices. The Makati Business Club has long stood for informed dialogue and practical reform. Today, we continue that mission by asking not only how global conflict affects us, but how the Philippines can respond with clarity, resilience, and strategic foresight. Because while we may not control global wars, we can control how prepared we are for their consequences. I can think of no better persons to speak with us on this than our guests today, our friends Stevie Cuunjieng and Bob Herrera-Lim. I have always sought and trusted their views, and they have always provided valuable insights. Thank you, and may today's discussion move us from awareness to action.
Thank you very much, Ms. Riza, for those insightful remarks. To begin today's discussion, we'd like to call on our first speaker who will be sharing important insights on the broader political and economic implications of the ongoing conflict. Mr. Roberto Bob Herrera Lim is the Managing Director at Teneo and Fellow at the Foundation for Economic Freedom. Roberto Bob Herrera-Lim is a leading political economist with over 2 decades of experience analyzing political and business risk across Southeast Asia. He advises multinational firms and investors on market entry, regulatory developments, and macroeconomic trends. Prior to his current role, he worked with Eurasia Group and held positions in government, the legal profession, and corporate governance research. Let us welcome Mr. Roberto Bob Herrera-Lim.
Hi, I hope you can hear me. And can you see the screen share?
Yes, yes, we can see.
Yes. So thank you very much. And I apologize if sometimes there will be technical glitches because I have been using Zoom, Microsoft Teams, Google Meets for the past few days, and sometimes I confuse what is on and how to move them about. But first of all, thank you very much, Riza, for that very kind introduction. I have always appreciated Riza's counsel when talking about the Philippines, when talking about the Philippine business community, and I hope I live up to her expectations about being able to provide you with a view of what is happening in the world and how it affects us. Because it will not only affect us today, it will affect us years down the road. That is the nature of what is happening today. And let's start. I have to give you an idea and sort of the introduction to what Teneo is. We have no relationship to that famous school in Katipunan. We are a global political risk consulting firm with offices around the world. We have multiple, shall we say, business lines. I belong to the Risk Advisory Group. The Risk Advisory Group advises clients on political risk, on security risk, and basically anything that affects the operating environment. Our sense is it's not only what's important is not only the event risk, right? What the insurance clients normally care about: expropriation, nationalization, non-payment, but also the risks to your business model. Many companies and many of the companies, the foreign investors that come into the Philippines are our clients. They come in with expectations about what policymakers will do, about how people will act or react, and we stress test those assumptions about doing business with that kind of, shall we say, political overlay. So, having introduced Teneo to you, let's start with the formulation of what's happening right now. And the focus, although the focus is going to be a lot on the Middle East, we watch politics writ large in Southeast Asia and in the Philippines, and definitely at some point today, if their plans don't miscarry, the House committee will vote on whether or not Sara Duterte's impeachment, shall we say, their findings will be to recommend or not recommend that she be charged with the Senate. And obviously, what happens with that impeachment process will have material effects or could have material effects on what happens to the Philippines 2 years down the road. So we can't disentangle all these events, all these things from what is happening in the world outside, from what is happening within our country. So the first thing we will discuss is where are we in the conflict. So right now we are in sort of a lull. The conflict has not ended, but at the same time, petrochemical product, crude product, other chemicals that come from petrochemical processes are not making it in significant enough numbers across the straits. You will read news of one tanker having made it through, a couple making it through, etc. And that just highlights how important this whole strait is to us. And, the question is, when does this end? Now, the first idea is both sides want to end this, right? Because if you are the United States, you are Donald Trump, you are facing midterm elections in November. and at some point, the prospect of painful pump prices. We are entering summer driving season in the States. I lived in the States for 13 years, and summer driving season is always a big thing. It is when people take their kids out, it is when they send them to camp, etc. So that's when they feel the cost as much, right? Because you take plane rides. So as much as possible, the US would probably like to limit this pain because then it feeds into the election cycle. And the fear of the US, or the fear if you are the administration right now, your worry is that the House of Representatives will be flipped. It is now controlled by the Republicans. Your fear is that it will be controlled by the Democrats. And from that, their ability to sort of leverage political battles increases. Okay, so that's the first thing. On the other hand, if you are Iran, obviously, Iran is used to conflict and they can endure a lot more than many countries can, regardless of whether, I'd like to phrase this, regardless of where you stand on who is right and who is wrong, these are the conditions that exist within them today. And they can withstand a fair amount of conflict. They had a war in the 1980s with Iraq. They have been under sanctions for decades. They can withstand a fair amount of pain. Now, the big challenge for Iraq is at some point, and you will read this, they need storage capacity for their fuel, for the crude they are pumping. The moment they have to stop pumping, that leads to a cascade of bad outcomes because some of their fields are what you call low pressure fields. And the problem with low pressure fields is restarting them is difficult, costly, and sometimes impossible, and it takes time. Now, this will have repercussions for us because if those fields don't start up, at some point, the global sense of what is the supply available will also decline. So there are incentives on both sides to reduce the conflict or to stop it in the short term. What complicates this is, on the one hand, in the United States, it is basically a centralized decision making. US President Donald Trump, Pete Hegseth, and maybe a few members of their inner circle. On the other side, the attacks on Iran have eviscerated what used to be the top rung of the leadership. So right now you have two groups, the Republican Guard, which is sort of the military state within a state, and then the moderates, the civilians in parliament who might want a much more measured approach rather than a militant or hardline approach. But getting them to consensus is difficult. And what does that mean? The question is, what are we going to see? Are we going to see, a belief that we should outlast each other, whether they're US or Iran, or a belief that, no, we have to settle this as soon as possible because there are problems that are going to manifest very soon on the horizon. It could be political. In the case of the US, it could be technical. Even in the US, it could be political in the form not only of the midterms, but higher prices in the summer driving season. So that is the big question mark. And one of the things we have emphasized to clients is there is no straight line to a solution here. Because not only are we talking of Iran and the United States, this conflict basically has its roots in politics in the Middle East, which involves Israel. And the status of Israel, Israel's goals, these will factor into decisions being made right now by the different participants. So in short, in Filipino, masalimuot, this is a very complicated picture. And since it's almost like you have a difficult situation, right? But at the same time, you need solutions quickly. What's going to happen? The thing is, you're going to look for short-term solutions, but you might not solve the long-term problems. So that goes to the first point. The probability that any end to the immediate conflict, even if the US and Iran agree on something tomorrow, the probability that the immediate conflict, when it ends, produces a credible long-term path towards stability is still low. Because you have questions of the nuclear program, you have questions on Palestine, you have all these interrelated issues. Some of them may not be as visible or may not be as pronounced today, but they will be there. So the challenge is, it's almost like we see it in Myanmar, right? You get ceasefires every once in a while in Myanmar, but the question of whether or not the ethnic insurgents or the ethnic armed groups will get autonomy, will get what they want, is a big question. We saw that in the Philippines, right? When we had conflict in the South, the question of a ceasefire, could it lead to longer term peace, was always a big question until, we had those solutions in the 1990s. So given that, the probability that this will end in the near term is low. So that's the first thought. It's a long way to that thought, but that is the thought. And I think that's like our 80%. That's my 80% view on what's going to happen. So what's the near term challenge for the Philippines? We are seeing the first part of this problem, which is the rise in fuel. We've had them decline, but higher fuel prices. And then you will now get the next one, right? Which is right now we're in the midst of harvest season for vegetables. That's why if you go to the market, prices haven't gone up insofar as vegetables are concerned. Pork is overproduction in China, so there's not as much also of a problem there. But as time goes on, the agricultural supply chain will be under pressure. If you take a look at the price of urea, it was about 1,400 pesos before the crisis. Right now, it is at 2,600 pesos, and we are not yet in the rice planting season. Rice planting will start in June, roughly, and probably it will be higher unless there is a sense of a short-term resolution. So rice will come next in terms of price pressures, vegetables as we enter rainy season. And so whatever price effects we're seeing today, it's not yet finished. So we are going to start seeing this. And the question is, does this turn into a political narrative that disadvantages the current administration? Because the president promised 20 peso rice. Now, if you go to the provinces, this is probably the most felt disappointment, right? For many people, that he promised lower food prices. It's the same as the affordability question in the US. And therefore, the question is, does this affect the 2028 elections? And then this goes to the question of, if Sara's impeachment pushes forward, does this affect the political calculations around that impeachment? So there are a lot of complicating factors in terms of how our ability to manage the crisis turns into a broader political narrative. And if that happens, what does the administration do? Does it sort of give in to some populist tendencies, right? To be more, shall we say, to agree to increases in the minimum wage, to more spending. And more spending is a question already for many countries. Probably the most visible countries, Indonesia, if they continue with their subsidy programs, they will breach 3% of their the deficit target as a percentage of GDP. And if they breach that, and if markets react adversely, then the message we will be getting from markets is, if you breach deficit targets, if you are seen as fiscally lax, then that is going to be a problem for your currency. It is going to be a problem for asset prices. Okay. Longer term outcomes. The bigger challenge is, unlike we've had two sort of visible commodity price increases over the past 2 decades. The first was the commodity super cycle. Some of you may be too young to remember this. This was in the mid 2000s when commodity prices went up absent a conflict. It was simply, there was a lot of money sloshing around, and a lot of it found their way into commodities, and prices went up. Then the second was post-COVID, because again of the production disruptions. There has been enough research done that says that whenever the political price shock from energy comes from a geopolitical event, people are more attuned to it. The fear is higher. The sense that this will be an issue or a problem is much stronger, because people, if you're talking about COVID, people will say, okay, as long as we solve the virus and then we get back to work, life will be the same. Okay. And other things, there was a sense that as long as we can solve X problem, Y will come, which is that we will resume life as normal, etc. Right now, that X does not exist, or is very weak when you think about this current crisis. So the belief that things will go back to normal quickly is weak right now. And when that happens, the political demand is going to be on on creating the security in the things that we've missed or that we are lacking, which is energy security. Okay, that's going to be the first one. And that energy security will be pressure coming at both the household and the national level. People will want to put up solar. People will want to know that we are not as dependent on imported energy, or that there is energy that we can access at a reasonable price. The second is supply chain. We get most of our urea from abroad. We get a lot of it from some of it from producers such as Qatar and the Middle East. There will be a question of, can we not get more from Indonesia? Can we not get more from other countries? How do we improve agricultural efficiency? So the insecurity will manifest in the supply chain as well of food, because again, we are going to feel this in the third quarter. And one of the risks is right now, there are two things that are keeping prices down. The first, again, is harvest season. The second is the Thais and the Vietnamese still have had good harvest the past year. It drove rice prices down to their lowest in a long time. Now, if the Thais and the Vietnamese say, okay, we're going to cut back on production, if Thai and Vietnamese farmers say that, or if shipping costs remain high, imported rice will become more expensive, and that will be felt down the road. So at some point, people will say we need to build better food security. And finally, the last is the United States. In previous, for those old enough to remember it, there was always the sense that if there was any disruption in trade or in energy flows, that the US, the Western powers, would come together and find a way to disentangle, unlock, open wherever the bottlenecks are. That is quickly disappearing globally. It has definitely disappeared in large parts of Southeast Asia as a perception, and maybe as a reality even. So when that disappears, people will say, we need more security, we need more relationships, and that will have an effect on what we do next. So how do I diagram all of this? And this is how we do it, right? And this is where it matters for organizations such as MBC or for the companies in it. We are what you call geopolitical price takers in Asia. We are not the EU, we are not China, we are not even Japan, that we can sort of influence outcomes in different parts of the world, because we can either project power, we have diplomatic clout, we have multilateral clout, we take the price of what is available in the world. So if you take a look at the gray box there, these are the things we cannot basically control, right? And as I said, some of these factors are what's going to happen next. There will be a geopolitical resolution, or maybe not, to what is happening in the Gulf. There will be a rebuilding of supply chains of what has been destroyed. And then there will be the political and military effects of the conflict, the depletion in the weapon stocks of the United States that is happening right now, the very expensive missiles that are being used to defend Israel, to defend bases in the Middle East, to defend Gulf countries. These are being depleted. And what will the effect be? First is supply chain uncertainty. How quickly will supply come back online? Where will that be coming from? Will there be the threat of future disruption still? Those questions will persist. The second is, what will the US role in Asia be after this, right? Given two factors. One is, again, the depletion of US military equipment raises questions as to how prepared the US will be for a conflict in the next 3 to 5 years elsewhere in the world, especially one involving drones, involving missiles, involving the need for theater-level defense. Now, these are all questions that are going to be happening outside our coverage area, outside our ability to sort of influence. Now, where then does that feed in? It will feed into two things. The first is there will be a desire, this part of the chart, if you see or of the diagram, there will be a desire for supply chain security, energy security, and food security at its most basic. And when I say supply chain security, what we are seeing right now with many of our clients is, it used to be the question is, okay, we want to relocate from China, or we want to relocate from somewhere else towards parts of Southeast Asia. How are trade flows? How is your infrastructure? And that includes ports, etc. And how are you negotiating tariffs with the United States, or are you in free trade agreements? There's going to be an additional question asked. How is your security in the supply chain? And this is not very visible for many companies because at the end of the day, it can be plastics, it can be something that you don't see. We saw this with COVID, we saw this with the flooding in Thailand in 2011. Random components stopped showing up because somewhere down the line, somebody did not have the capacity to produce this. So if you are right now as a manufacturer, you are thinking, would it be better to stay put in China rather than move to Southeast Asia? Because at least in China, I know that they have some sufficiency in the supply chain. So many foreign direct investors, especially in manufacturing, might start asking these questions in the next few years because they need that supply chain security. And obviously, energy security and food security will be very popular issues for peoples throughout Southeast Asia. Now, both of these, the uncertainty, the issues where we are geopolitical price takers, these will feed into a few things that the Philippines will have to decide, both at the political level and the public level, right? Our foreign policy decisions. Like it or not, a fair amount of refined capacity exists in China. Like it or not, and this is no value judgment on where we are on foreign policy. A large part of the energy security stack will depend on China. You just go outside, you take a look. If you're trying to install solar right now, solar panels are made in China or Southeast Asia. It's not only the hardware that is made in China, it is the software itself, right? It goes into servers that you may not understand where they're going in. That is how you get the reading on your app about how much energy you've consumed. Now, as we try to build energy efficiency, integration of those systems will require what we call the software stack, right? The integration of systems. And if those systems are coming from China, much of that integration will be done by us acquiring IP that is made in China. So there will be a lot of foreign policy decisions. We will have to decide our security policy. Without going into too much into the South China Sea, West Philippine Sea, however you'd like to call it, we will have to make a decision in the near future. How does that affect what we want to do? And this raises the question, right? What is the national interest of the Philippines, and how do our policies support that national interest? And that national interest will grow wider in the next few years because of the insecurity that these political events have created. And then finally, the regional architecture. Will we need to build new regional architectures for energy security, for food security that is more robust than what we have right now? And all of these things, all of these decisions will feed into politics, policy, regulation, and SOE behavior. And this is the part that matters for many of you in the Makati Business Club, because if you take the price offered to you, and then this goes into the price taker argument, just to make it economic. If you take what politics offers you, you will not be happy. Why? Because Philippine politics has not proven to be an effective way of solving these problems, right? Because if we mishandle politics, policy, regulation, then the supply chain security, the energy security, the food security will also be a problem, right? So it almost is, we have to say it. You have to have a position on this, where the country goes. You have to have a seat at the table, because otherwise you will take the same price that we have been taking for the last 20, 30 years, which is an inability on the part of our political system to solve the problems that really need solving, and with the urgency with which they need solving, right? So we not only have to go in the right direction, we have to go in the right direction quickly. So this is going to be unavoidable for business organizations, for civil society organizations, for people to discuss. It is not simply about voting once every 6 years and hoping that the right outcome is delivered, which is already a weak hope already, but getting into the, shall we say, into the ears of policymakers, of decision makers, and saying this is the right decision, because there will be the potential for wrong decisions to happen. And what are wrong decisions? It can be increasing the role of the state, right? We learned that some time ago. Having the state as the provider of economic goods is something that we generally don't think works. Now, what if suddenly states like Indonesia is already thinking of doing this? What about price controls? It is a populist measure that has a lot of appeal, and you have been seeing that in some politicians' pronouncements. This is where the rubber hits the road for you, and it all starts from here. Now, what's the outcome? The outcome is two things. The first is we need energy, we need food, etc. So the question of what to build and where to get what, and how to tie systems together will be decided by the decisions that the government makes, by the private sector makes over the next 12 to 24 months for the next 3 years. So it is something we cannot get wrong. And the relationships, these can be new trade agreements, bilateral, multilateral. It can be thinking about relationships with regional powers, right? Japan, Korea, China, Australia, ASEAN. Why? Because it goes to the question, what is the US role going to be in Asia, right? We see all these talk of the US doing stuff in the Philippines. We've seen that plan for 4,000 acres, etc. I'm old enough to remember that we had once a plan to turn Subic into some kind of manufacturing hub. It fell by the wayside. Not, was it because our systems were wrong for it? Did we have the wrong people? There are multiple challenges. So we can have all these promises, but ultimately what happens here will affect what happens here, and ultimately it will affect the outcomes here. So I think this is the way I think of it. Now, what other issues are we thinking about in regard to the Philippines? The first is manufacturing critical minerals. We'd like to have capacity here to build manufacturing. We'd like to have capacity to source critical minerals because the world is moving towards electrification. We have nickel, we have copper, we have gold, we have cobalt, some of the materials that will be needed. But there are decades of negative narratives as to what the Philippines has failed to do, and those narratives are not going away easily. The second is we need coordinated government action. We cannot wait for 6 years for us to figure this out. The question is, how do we get there? I have ideas, and maybe you can ask me. Then discussions on industrial policy will increase, right? That we need slightly better way of formulating what needs to be done and putting in place the policy and people that need to get it done. And finally, this last question, and the biggest challenge for the Philippines, one of the bigger challenges for the Philippines is artificial intelligence. We talk a lot about it. The pace of change is incredible. Even skeptics are getting won over. And I think the way we think about this, right, without getting lost into the small, or not in the small details, but into the difficult details, is that AI will require a new way of extracting knowledge. When Google first came, again, many of you are too young to remember this probably. When Google first came in the late 1990s, after years of disorganized search, it allowed for a productivity breakthrough for many people who do research, including me. AI can lead to even greater changes. Why? Because it can be agentic. It can function even though we are not telling it what and how it should be doing things, and we wait for the output. So AI will be gradually captured by people who can do critical thinking. And education will be critical in this. The big challenge is, if you go outside right now and you ask yourself, how ready is our educational system for this? It is difficult to be optimistic, and I am being frank about it, because we suffered through a COVID deficit in the pandemic. We need to build skills up. It's not simply math skills. It's not simply AI skills. It is the ability to logically analyze, to be broader thinkers. Because if we fail that, then skilled human exports will continue, right? We will continue to export our best workers who will find greater value abroad, the ability to be traded abroad. And that's going to be the sad reality that we will face. So I will stop there. and maybe you can start asking me questions about where things are going. I can go into much more detail, but I've probably talked too long already. So thank you for that, and I'll stop sharing.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Herrera-Lim, for your comprehensive presentation. Just to briefly highlight some important points that were raised before we go into the questions. So, you mentioned that the conflict is currently in a lull, with the possibility of a ceasefire, but then again, that will not necessarily build supply chains right away. Rice and vegetables have already gone up, but there is the possibility that it will increase further in the coming weeks. ASEAN and other countries are seeking alternative alliances due to the rising conflict. And countries will now prioritize food and energy security, as well as rebuilding supply chains, which can then affect how they will be approaching their foreign policy decisions. Also, another important point is that, price controls, which are initially viewed as a populist measure, is now being reconsidered. And of course, the many challenges that is surrounding AI development in the Philippines, and how the rise of AI will really make education for the country critical. Before we move on to our next speaker, I'd like to check the Zoom chat room if anybody has any questions. We'll accommodate around one or two questions before we proceed with our next speaker. So feel free to type your questions into the chat box. Okay. If there are no questions so far, we'll be having another Q&A with our two speakers later in a more panel discussion format. Yeah, for while we are sorry. Yeah, so thank you again, Mr. Herrera-Lim, for those insights. Our next speaker is Mr. Stevie Cuunjieng, who's an independent director of the Maharlika Investment Corporation. He will discuss his perspectives on the macroeconomic and financial market implications of the conflict. Stevie Cuunjieng is a seasoned investment banker with over 2 decades of experience across Asia Pacific. He previously served as chairman and CEO of Evercore Asia and
No,
held.
I'm not. I'm not. I retired in 2022.
Okay, sorry for that. Um, and he's also held senior roles at Macquarie, Merrill Lynch, and Salomon Brothers, advising on major capital market transactions. He won 14 Deals of the Year awards from 2005 to 2018, and Evercore was chosen Best Advisory Firm in Asia in 2016. Earlier in his career, he was one of 4 agents chosen in Your Money's global list of top 50 under 40 in banking and finance, and was one of the global finance's emerging market superstars. Let us welcome Mr. Stevie Cuunjieng. Thank you.
Well, first, uh, thank you very much again for inviting me, Bettina, and to the Makati Business Club. I suppose the time I spoke of during COVID wasn't so bad, so you were kind enough to invite me again, and thank you. I just want to clear, I retired from Evercore in 2022. I was employee number one and chairman and CEO for Asia, but that ended 4 years ago. So now, my apologies to all of you. I didn't have time to prepare a presentation, but I will do my best to be as clear as I can on what are the challenges based on the topic. But I think before we understand the challenges, we need to understand the nature of the protagonists who are causing this challenge to us immediately, which is Iran and the USA. And reminds you of the old joke there was about this guy was asked to write about the US-Canada fishing treaty from either point of view. And he failed because he wrote it from the point of view of the fish. And I think we are like the fish. We're not choosing one, we're not involved, but yet we're affected. And apart from Iran, we're probably the most affected region. So first, we need to understand geography. The Gulf states, their oil goes one way, two ways. It goes either to the east or to the west. To the east, it goes through the Strait of Hormuz, and that's about 20% of the world's supply of oil and a slightly higher percentage of fertilizer and natural gas. But 80% of that goes to Asia. Now, the rest goes through the Red Sea and goes through the Suez Canal, and that mostly goes to Europe and Africa, but most of Northern Africa. So while people are very concerned, people have asked, why are we highly affected? Because we've just basically taken out 80% of our supply, because 80% of that supply goes to Asia. So first understand why it affects us more than everybody else. The second thing is, I would strongly urge you to read the book. I bought it, but watch the YouTube interview of Vali Nasser. He's an Iranian scholar. His father was, I think, vice chancellor of Tehran University. They left when the Shah fled. He's a professor at Johns Hopkins, and he was on the National Security Council's advisory team on Iran during the Obama administration. Michal Hussein of Bloomberg had a very, very insightful interview with him about a month ago, which is available on YouTube. And I urge anybody who wants to understand what it will take to solve or not solve this to watch that interview, because he's very, very analytical in explaining the context behind this. First, he said, the Iranians view this as a final battle. They will either die and the government they'll fall, or what he calls the mow the lawn strategy will end. The mow the lawn strategy means every 6 months or so, Israel or the US tries to do something to keep them in line. They want that to end. So basically, they're saying we're going to fight and fight and fight no matter what, and accept everything, so that after this, the US and Israel will say, let's not bother with them anymore. It's too much trouble. Now, if you say, is that a suicidal strategy? No, it's not. It worked for Afghanistan. After 20 years of fighting only the US and their allies, the Taliban are back and in control. We're not saying they're nice people, but they won. And prior to that, Vietnam. People people think, oh, Vietnam, they kicked out the French and they kicked out the Americans. People don't realize, because history is written by the winners. The Japanese actually abandoned them a couple of months before the end of World War II, because when they had to shore their defenses, they said, let's concentrate on, Malaysia, Philippines, people like that. Those Vietnamese, they're too tough. And they just abandoned it. And that's why the war started after independence, because when the French came back, Ho Chi Minh said, why are you here? We're already independent, because the Japanese left. So that's is the first thing. They said, we will fight until the end. The second thing is, how hard can they fight? Because this leads into my point, which is, how long could this take? Okay. How hard can they fight? Vali Nasser also explains, you have to understand, sanctions, that's nothing new. They've been sanctioned since this regime started in one level of degree or harsher since 1979. So they're used to it. But he said the most important lesson Iran learned was in 1980, when Saddam Hussein and Iraq invaded Iran. It took 8 years for them to beat back Iraq, but they did. And Iraq was supported by the US, the West, and all the other Arab countries, because they're Sunni and Iran is Shia. Okay? Now, and they felt, after that, they said, we have to be extremely self-resilient. So they actually are a very contained country. 75 to 80% of their graduates are STEM. So they make all their armaments, and about 80% of whatever finished products they produce, whether in industry, in food, in weaponry, are all made in country. So they are basically saying sanctions, who cares? It hurts, but it's not catastrophic because they basically did the exact opposite of the Philippines did, which is let market forces decide what we are going to be and who will be. They're saying no, we have to be self-sufficient in everything, even advanced. And the last thing is they're an ancient culture that's very, very proud. And so they are going to basically, his view, fight till the end. And they basically are going to use the tactic that the Vietnamese used against the Americans and the Afghans, the Taliban, which is our capacity to absorb pain is much greater than yours. And in the end, you will give up before us. But they don't doubt how painful the sacrifice will be. They're just ready to do it. That's his thesis. Now, in addition, on warfare, he said they're also ready for this because they have followed what they call mosaic warfare or asymmetric warfare. They basically have delegated authorities to regional governments and regional military commanders, where you wipe out the head, which is what happened, and it's okay. The next level has the authority to do what it wants with the weaponry and the assets they have and do it in a decentralized manner. So, first, you need to understand that is the mentality of who the US picked a fight with. I'm not saying they're nice people. I'm not saying it's right. I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm not saying who will succeed. But that kind of toughness, which we've already seen over 8 weeks, is not going to end. Now, let's look at the other side, the US. I can't forget who I saw, some commentator on one of those weekly talk shows this week or Meet the Press. And he said, Trump overruled his advisor and frankly was higher level of confidence because of the easy success in basically Venezuela. But the guy said, and I'm not saying this is correct or wrong, he said the difference between Venezuela and Iran, because both were very repressive, the economy suffered in both of them greatly prior to their invasions. They said Venezuela is like a mafia state. And he said Iran is like a mafia state run by mullahs. So they're much more determined to keep going. So they had underestimated the resilience, and that's why they were completely unprepared for the blockage of the Strait of Hormuz because they thought it would all be over in a couple of days when they eliminated the entire first tier of leadership. Because, like in Venezuela, they just had to arrest Maduro and his wife, and everybody sort of came in. So they feel there was a lot of, frankly, ignorance and misunderstanding of what they were dealing with. So now, with that as the premise, what happens? First, because of all the damage, please understand it takes a month for the oil tankers to reach Asia from the Strait. So it goes first, it goes east, and then obviously the first customers are the subcontinent, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, which is why Pakistan has been very active because they hurt a lot. In India, they're saying some restaurants are even closing because they cannot get any cooking oil or LPG gas and so on and so forth. So then it goes to us. In our area, it takes about a month. Now, most countries, unlike us, don't leave it to the private sector and market forces. So, in addition, they carry much more days of strategic reserves than we do. China has close to a year's worth of oil supply stored in country. Most other countries have 90 to 180 days. We, because we want to privatize everything and leave it to market forces, we have 45 days. All right? So the others are at least 90. And in China's case, I think it's over 270. All right? Now, days. Now. So it takes a month. So it was only basically a couple of weeks ago when the ships that had left the strait stopped arriving in Asia. And because of the damage done, like for example, on natural gas, the plant of Qatar processes about 20% of the natural gas. It was hit in the wars, and they said for some parts of the plant, it will take 3 to 5 years to repair. Now, and pumping oil and shipping it is not a very simple matter. It's not like you're going to call up Lazada and Shopee and say, can you deliver this tomorrow? It will take time to ramp up production again, which is set down, time to load them to tankers, time for the tankers to get to us, time for them to be unloaded in the destination site, time for them to be processed. And then in our case, unfortunately, time for 2/3 of them to be exported to us if it ever gets to us. So that is why even if it ends tomorrow, it doesn't end. And if you think what we've seen is bad, if things don't end, it will get worse because people are not yet overtly panicking because they are only running out of new oil now and only starting to use their reserves. But if you look in Asia, most of the exporters of finished products, which we unfortunately require for 2/3 of what, or a third of what we need, because Petron can only handle, I think, about 60%, because we allowed Caltex and Shell to shut down. We rely on imports. Who are the major exporters of finished products? Number one is China, then to a lesser extent, Taiwan, Korea, and Japan, and a very small amount from Malaysia. Thailand is self-sufficient, Indonesia is generally self-sufficient, but they're not major exporters. Now, that's just one, because oil has roughly doubled in price. On December 15, I think it was $59. I think this morning it's 111. But you also have to understand, one of the things we're told is if there's surplus in the US and Canada, why don't we import from them to replace? First of all, they're not big exporters. They're just net exporters. But second, oil is not one product. There are grades and levels of sulfur. So first you have light. That's why you have the Texas called light sweet crude, which is the West Texas Intermediate. Then you have Brent oil, which is mostly Middle East oil, which is also relatively light. Then you have the medium quality oil, heavier, like Venezuela. And you have the heavy oil, which is basically from sands, which is like basically Canadian. Then you have low, medium, and high sulfur content and other impurities. And guess what? The oil refineries are generally programmed to handle the type of oil they get. And if the type of oil is separate, they cannot refine that easily. It has to be blended, it has to be this, it has to be that. So it is not as simple as just giving me oil and output comes this. Second, production is limited. With the certain type of oil, you can make only so much gasoline, so much kerosene, which is jet fuel, and so much diesel. And there has been because of the light nature, which is very popular for diesel and jet fuel, that has gone up higher. Like before the crisis, jet fuel was about $90 per barrel equivalent, and it's now 220 if you can find it. So it's not just price, it's source, because now China has said No more exports because what we can import, we're going to keep, and we don't want to draw down our reserves, and they're the biggest exporter in the region. So there's a lot more complexity to this that we are going to face. It's much more difficult and it's much more disruptive. The closest thing to this would be for those old enough, 1973 and 74, where to deal with supply constraints, you had to do what's called demand destruction, rationing of gasoline, limiting hours of commercial enterprises, reserving it for public transport and factories. This is what we had to do. I was 14 years old, but I remember what we had to do. Everybody started carpooling, things like that, because you were given X liters a month per household. It could come to that. All right, so that's first where we are. So now the question is, what should we do? All right, now, first is, as I've said many times, let me use one cliche and one really corny line. Okay. The cliche is you fix your roof when the sun is shining, not during a typhoon. The second is a really corny line from Dolly Parton, which I heard, I think Paul Krugman or somebody quote kind of amusingly. And she said in one of her songs, "You cannot direct the wind, but you can adjust the sails." We have not adjusted the sails because given our complete abandonment of any semblance of government policy and industrial policy towards this and leaving it completely to the private sector and costs, our motto really is bahala na si Batman. Now, no other country in Asia is as exposed to everything as we are. And you think I'm just talking theory? Okay, in 2010, or sorry, 2009 actually, in 2010, uh, Exxon was selling Esso Malaysia, which is the smallest of the retailers and refineries in Asia. And Exxon never appoints advisors, they're so arrogant. But if you've done good things for them, like you help somebody buy an asset they wanted to sell or help sell an asset they wanted to buy to them, they kind of call up their favorite investment bankers and say, hey, this thing's coming up. I'm giving you a head start so you can find a potential buyer or you can find the asset we're looking for. And so Evercore got one of those calls, and I had recently just joined Evercore. So they said, find someone who's willing to do it. And fortunately, I was able to persuade Petron to look at it, and I'll get to the conclusion. They won. Petron owns what used to be Esso Malaysia. Okay. Now, Esso Malaysia is the smallest of the major retailers and also has the smallest oil refinery in Port Dickson. What did the Malaysian Ministry of Energy say to all potential buyers? And there were a couple of international who were looking at it, but mostly the other domestics, Petronas, and I forgot this other one, which was owned by the Army Pension Fund. They're like the number two. They were all looking at it, okay? And they said, you can expand this plant, you can increase the product line, but you cannot close the refinery. Even though it's the smallest and the least efficient, the terms of approval are you cannot close the refinery because we always want to have 100% capability of refining crude oil to fit 100% of our demand. Now, other countries have basically said some things, everything is run commercially to the best extent we can, and everything is primarily private sector. But some things are too important to solely leave to the private sector because there are national security issues, there are country security issues, and there are basically insurance policies we need so that in time of crisis, it does not hurt. And most people feel food security and energy security, to the extent they can have it, is one of them. And we chose, and the one country actually who's in a bad position like us is Vietnam, because Vietnam has only one refinery and it also cannot match the entire production. Vietnam has already told all airlines flying Ho Chi Minh and Hanoi, international flights, you need to basically have enough fuel to go back as well. You can't just show up and refill because we're preserving our supply for outgoing flights that originate out of Ho Chi Minh and Hanoi. But most of the others, Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, have all said we are going to be masters of our fate with regard to supplying finished products to ourselves. Now, when times are normal, fine, everything's good. But when times are not, what are you going to do? Starve? Shut down? That is why some people temper this, because some things are too important to leave to the vicissitudes of market forces and market prices. Some things are developmental. Some things are like an insurance policy. You may have to pay for it even when you don't need it. But if you, as I said, you fix your roof when the sun is shining, not when it's raining. What could we have done 15 years ago, which we didn't do until 6 years ago, or not six, 4 years ago? Lessen our dependence on oil. Okay? Sorry, somebody's saying the sound comes in and out. Is that true for everybody or just one person?
Yeah, I think,
Right.
Stephen, it was out for like a few seconds towards the end.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah.
So anyway, so so what did our other Asian neighbors do and we did not? I bought my first hybrid car in the US in 2006, a Prius. Fantastic. I got 45 to 50 miles per gallon. Okay. And it's hybrid now. And when my family moved back here in 2010, I brought the car back. I had to sell it in 2016 because even the one Toyota dealership that sold Priuses said, you didn't buy it from us. We're not going to service your car. All right. But why was that the case? In most of the countries, because that Prius I bought was the version 3 already. So it had been sold as a niche product since around 1999, 2000. Then it kind of went mainstream around 2004, became sufficiently competitive that you could use it for a reasonable distance, reasonable speed, because an electric car is a glorified golf cart. Okay, it just has a much more efficient battery and more powerful one. But the technology, just like when they say, oh, modular nuclear, that's just a nuclear submarine put on shore. All right. And the cost, all right. So now, in basically 2005 to 2008, most of the other Asian countries gave incentives to make it cost efficient to move to hybrid. And since then, they have moved on to giving incentives to electric cars and so on. And you go, never mind to Hong Kong and Singapore or China, go to Thailand or Malaysia. Most of the taxis are already electric or plug-in hybrid. They've even gone beyond the old hybrid, like the Prius is out of date already. Most of their buses are electric, hybrid, or run on hydrogen or LPG. In 2010, I mean, sorry, was it 2010? Yeah, 2010, there was a big push to have President Noynoy approve this, and the finance team said, we need the money. We can't afford to give a subsidy. And if we give a subsidy, everybody else will ask, well, we're paying for it now. Can you imagine how much lower your oil import bill would be if instead of fueling your cars, you were charging them because you fuel it, there's only one source, okay? Hydrocarbons. You charge it, it could be renewable, it could be nuclear for those who like it could be natural gas, it could be coal, it could be the various other types like hydro, everything, battery storage, so on. So these countries said exactly what Dolly Parton said. We cannot change the direction of the wind, but we can adjust the sails. You can make yourself less exposed. Not just I'm ready by having the capacity to refine oil in country so that as long as I buy oil, I can take care of it and not dependent on a two-stage. Somebody else has to import the oil and then export the finished product to us. No, they said we can't do anything about oil supply. We have to import, but at least once we get it, we can handle it in country. But on top of that, they're basically saying, how do I reduce hydrocarbon dependence? Now, what are the rest of our neighbors or the globe doing? And this is, you can also find this talk. It was very interesting of Daniel Yergin, the guy who wrote The Price, which is considered the Bible of the oil industry, okay? And I think he's already in his 80s, but he had a very good interview on Bloomberg, which is also on YouTube. He basically said 50% of new cars and trucks in China are all electric. In fact, in Beijing, if you buy a new car, you cannot register it unless it's electric. And then he said in Europe, it's about 20% and rising, and the US is the laggard at 6%. Now, I think Southeast Asia is somewhere in between Europe and China. But if half your new cars, can you imagine how much you've reduced your hydrocarbon dependence if half of your transportation compared to 10 years ago, where it was 100%, are now hydrocarbon free? So that's just on energy, just what we have to do. Now, same thing. We used to have fertilizer manufacturing prior to our debt rescheduling. Now we don't. Again, urea, which is a petrochemical product, according to Secretary Dominguez, is the most popular and the most efficient fertilizer for rice, and what is used by nearly all our rice farmers because it's already so inefficient. You want the most yield that you can from our inefficient structure. He has also told me urea alone has gone up more than double in 3 months, if you can find it. Another client of mine whose board I used to be on said, and their industrial quality agriculture company said, we can't even find urea. We have confirmed orders for fertilizers, but they're telling us force majeure, we can't give it. We don't learn. This is what happened during COVID. And I remember I see Risa Mantaring, hi, there, but we were discussing this. I remember one of the boards we were on. Other countries, you had the leading countries that actually came up with their own vaccines: America, the US, Germany. Okay, the RMNA of Moderna is actually German-Turkish scientists. Okay, in German now. Then you had obviously the traditional vaccines which were made in Europe and China. Then you had the second tier, which were people who were making the vaccines under license. That's why when the vaccines eventually came here, most of them came from Thailand. The third was people like us who said, can we please import it? And you know what we couldn't even do? We couldn't even import it in bulk. In other words, basically, instead of importing it in the actual vaccine form to inject, you give it in bulk and then you repackage it smaller so that it's more efficient. Apparently, we couldn't even do that. So we had to get it us in a state that was ready to be injected. And there was talk at the time, can we have a finishing plant? Can we have the license? Can we have this? Can we have that? And I thought it was kind of pathetic that we were just hoping to be able to have a finishing plant, which means you'd get the bulk vaccine and repackage it from a big jar into, in effect, a small jar, so it can be infected. We haven't done anything of that sort. And now we are in the same position again on fertilizers, on refining finished products, on food security. If you look at our food security, I'm not an expert and I will not claim to be, but our productivity in rice is about less than half, I'm told, of Thailand and Vietnam. So if we even bridged half that gap, we wouldn't have to import. But the only way you bridge that gap is with scale. I remember I was traveling once from in Da Nang area for a deal, and there were all these rice fields. And my partner, not partner, he was in Evercore, but my colleague who was in another investment bank was telling me, he said, "Oh, you see that carabao? That's just for decoration. They're going to eat it in the next new year because everything is mechanized already." And so while the individual farmers own the land, they all have co-ops of like 50,000 hectares, not the 5 hectare we have. And they're forced to be in the co-op. They're members of the co-op. And that's why they have all the efficiencies of scale in manufacturing. Now, like if you go to the US, the number one brand of butter is Land O'Lakes. Land O'Lakes is a co-op. It's not a company. It's owned by the member farmers. Okay. Now, one of the things Sonny Dominguez said in his interview with me last Friday, which was very useful, he said, the problem with co-ops is in the Philippines, we want the farmers to be the managers. The farmers can be the members. You want professional managers, so you get the results you need. And he said, yeah, exactly. Like Land O'Lakes and these places in Vietnam and Thailand, they have co-ops, but the co-ops are professionally run. They're owned by the farmers who are members, but they're not run by them. And the other example is corporate farming. If we are so incompetent to not have co-ops that are run properly, and it seems to be true in power generation too, then maybe we just corporatize. And Del Monte and these pineapple and banana companies, most of them are corporate farmers. And you know what? You don't have to own the land. You can lease it. Most of the land of these banana plantations and pineapple plantations are leased. But it's time to do that. And then the problem is you can't also just leave that to the private sector. As Sonny Dominguez explained to me, to grow a hectare worth of rice, you need 10 tons of water. You need 4 tons of water for corn, but you need 10 tons for rice. And so what do you have to have? Irrigation and dams to build up the water. And he said, he told me, it's in the interview, he looked up the records of the agriculture department, and before World War II, the Americans, to anticipate this, with less than 20 million people at the time, were planning 5 major dams so that there would be enough water and irrigation for Luzon. We only built 2, he said, or 3, I'm not sure, but and much later. And he also told me, I asked him, when was the last time we were self-sufficient in rice? He said 1988, during the Korea administration. And I said, why aren't we anymore? He said, we were 66 million people then. At that time, Thailand had 55 million people and we had 66. And today we have what? Close to 120, and Thailand has 75. So our productivity we want to go forth and multiply, but as he said quite wittily, we did not breed to the feed. You want to have population growth and be ready to feed, educate, and employ them. So we need to start having fundamental long-term moves on energy security, industrial policy, and food security. They are not easy. But as I tell everybody, did this country totally fail in industrial policy from independence to our debt rescheduling? Yes, it was terrible. and I can explain a little bit how it's terrible compared to other countries. How was it terrible? We protected one guy or two people in the industry and just allowed them to continue to do it with price protection against imports and no quality assurance. What did other countries like Japan and Korea and even Thailand and agriculture and Malaysia do? We will protect you, but there are targets set every 5 years on how you have to improve so that in X number of years, you become globally equivalent so you can start exporting. And then, even though our local market does not have the scale you need to be of global quality, you can start exporting to be global quality. Remember BF Goodyear tires? It's now globally owned by Sime Darby because the rubber came from Malaysia anyway. You buy rubber gloves now, they're all over. Palm oil, palm plantations, those are all Malaysian, which became, they chose rubber and palm oil among things where to be globally competitive. Thailand also chose basically not just rice and agriculture, but branded rice and branded food products, agriculture, to go up the food chain. What did Indonesia do? During Widodo's time, they said, I'm tired of being the #1 exporter of nickel and copper concentrate. We are now going to process it here, whether you like it or not. And in the year before Widodo did that, please correct me if my data's wrong because I'm doing this off memory. I think there was I read in nickel, $3.9 billion of exports. This was about 10 years ago. 8 years later, it was $40 billion because you processed it there. So we have Pasar. We sold it cheap. It's now shut down because there's a glut. But if we bought Pasar and told everybody you had to basically smelt your copper concentrate in Pasar, only what cannot be handled by Pasar we export, then we're fine. So those are basically my points. I've been asked to shut up so you can ask questions, so now I'll shut up.
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Cuunjieng, for that very insightful discussion. Uh,
Again, my apologies if some things were wrong because I literally had no notes because I didn't have time to prepare. So again, my apologies to everyone.
and no worries. I think it was a very engaging discussion. So now we'd like to open the floor to Q&A to both our speakers. We'd like to also welcome back Mr. Bob Herrera-Lim. I think we already got two questions during the discussion, so I'll proceed with them for now. But for those who would like to ask questions, kindly type your questions in the
Okay,
chat
I'll be
box.
very insulted if my friend Risa Mantaring doesn't ask a question directly.
Yeah.
By
Oh
the
yeah.
way, plug, she's coming out in Bunker After Dark soon, so please watch. It was it was so good, her interview. It's in two parts. One show was not enough for Risa. Ayan. Yeah, I set the expectations na Risa. Lahat kayo manood. Yung dating presidente mo, guest ng Bunker After Dark.
You set the expectations. I can only fail to meet
Oh.
it.
Yeah,
Please
yeah,
go
we're
ahead,
very
Bettina.
much looking forward to that. Yeah, for those who are joining us on FB Live, you may also post some comments in the comment section, and my colleagues will consolidate that. I guess the first one we got is from Romel Regino of Altius Inspiro. Should the government continue subsidizing fuel this crisis, and for how long? I think he's referring to the price caps that were mentioned by Secretary
Okay.
Green, because we're
Yeah.
not really
Okay.
subsidizing.
Rather than pretend to be smart on something I'm not an expert on, let me quote someone who I think is smart and an expert on it, Sonny Dominguez. He said his view was rather than subsidize across the board, use the amounts to give direct aid to public transport. Because at least if you subsidize public transport only, you are definitely helping the people who need the most help. Now, we're not saying the other people don't need help, but in an imperfect system, when you're subsidizing, you want to basically have the most benefit and deal with what you have. Number two, he also said, which I agree with, if you intervene, you shouldn't intervene to the point that it's no longer have any relation to market, because then you're skewing demand. Now, sometimes when things are very expensive, you have what's called demand destruction. But if that's what's the result, because we were so unresilient and unwilling to do what other countries did to lessen our exposure to hydrocarbon, then we have to deal with it. But the problem is, okay, why did the Oil Price Stabilization Fund, the OPSF, to people old enough who remembered it, why did it fail during the time of President Aquino, the first President Aquino, and then President Ramos ended it? Okay, now, but yet other countries, Thailand and Malaysia and Indonesia, have equivalents of OPSF. How does the Oil Price Stabilization Fund work? When times are cheap, you charge more to build up a buffer. When times are bad, you charge less and use that buffer. And over time, now it's an art. A lot of people on balance run deficits that they have to make up when times are good. But during the first Aquino administration, because it started during the late first President Marcos era, we were just running deficits because when times were expensive, we would subsidize. When times were good, we wouldn't increase it. Now, was that just a failure of political will? Actually, sad to say, in fairness to President Aquino, it's also political survival. Because from 86 to 89, we had, depending on how you count it, 6 to 9 coup attempts. And each coup attempt was precipitated by an oil price increase, which got the people angry. So they were just politically too scared and too fragile to do what they needed to do. And when the Ramos administration came in, he just said, let's just abolish this. Write off the deficits we have, and from now on, just market prices. But here we are. Other countries with a little more discipline. It's not perfect, but at least it's a buffer when you need it. Now, that buffer cannot last forever. And I've read in Indonesia, and so when people say, oh, even power rates, Indonesia, Thailand, they subsidize, Vietnam, they subsidize it. They don't subsidize it to the point of a loss. They subsidize it to the point of substandard compared to the private sector returns because they view it as a loss leader that spurs development, number one. I think most of us businessmen understand what a loss leader is. But number two, more important than that, it's not just subsidized. They basically subsidize it to industrial customers. And the people who pay for it are the commercial and the residential customers who are then forced to be more efficient from day one because they said there is very little multiplier effect to commercial customers. There's no multiplier effect to residential customers, but there's 6 to 7 new jobs for every industrial enterprise that is in heavy manufacturing. So to make them competitive, they're basically saying these parts of the economy will suffer. Like, for example, there's a joke. What do you call an SUV in Vietnam? A motorcycle. Because all vehicles in Vietnam are subject to 300% tax. So you have to literally be a millionaire to own a car. So there.
Bob, do you have
Yeah,
any thoughts?
Bettina, yeah, if I can add. So, tama yun. The problem with subsidies is you have a scarce resource that you are telling people it is okay to consume now.
Exactly.
So you don't want to do that, especially because importing tayo, right? If we produce stuff, then maybe we have some leeway. But we are importing. So the goal is to help the people who are the most vulnerable. The problem is we have a very bad system of distributing help. The Thais have welfare cards that are linked to debit accounts. So you can target very quickly somebody who needs to receive money. It's a form of official bribery in a way, but they can do it really effectively. Now, so we don't have that. For other countries, like Indo, they have two types of fuel. One is very subsidized. It is subsidized na, it comes off the budget. The other fuel, it is theoretically not subsidized, but the government sets the price, right? So theoretically unregulated, but in reality regulated. The problem is then Pertamina loses money on it, and the government then has to pay Pertamina to compensate it for the losses. But the problem of Indo right now is many capital markets are looking at whether or not Indo will breach its deficit of 3% of GDP, etc. And that is one of the big questions. What is the tolerance for fiscal space right now for many countries? That is why the Thais have been saying, okay, we might need to borrow more, but it'll kick up our debt to GDP to 70%, etc. So COVID, everyone got sort of a semi-free pass. I don't know how emerging markets will be received with larger subsidies going forward. So that's the risk always. Let's not subsidize, but let's help the people who need help the most.
I agree with you, Bob. It's kind of like what Sonny Dominguez said. He's not saying subsidize to everyone, directly give it. And Risa Mantaring in a comment mentioned, yes, that's what's being done with the ayuda. But I agree with you 100%, Bob, with no buts. It's basically if we had a more robust delivery system for these things so that basically it's like saying, I have a bad tooth, o sige, barilin natin versus let's fix it. No, basically, you build up that kind of distribution system, that kind of work for government when the sun is shining, not when it's raining. But so the point is saying, what do we do in the short term? I said, besides doing what we're limited to do, can we start executing in the long term so that the next time we don't say again, what do we do in the short term? Because you know what? If you keep doing it in the short term, your short-term problems will just get worse and worse and worse.
Yeah, and maybe, Stevie, this is a good, because one of the things we haven't figured out as external observers, we have a national ID system. Theoretically, there's an incentive for the banks to link to that, because then you get access and the government can distribute it. But the national ID system is, optimistically fits and starts. Worst case is we don't know where it's going. So there seems to be a failure in the market somewhere.
Okay,
where theoretically, like in Thailand, Krung Sri is linked to Krung Sri Bank is linked to the welfare system.
They just use their equivalent of Alipay, GCash, and PayMaya. That's how it's done. They're saying if we're too stupid to do it government-wise, the government will sanction. I mean, basically, Sonny Dominguez said when they gave the ayuda imperfect as it was in during COVID, the SSS gave it to your GCash or PayMaya account.
Yeah.
And
so the question is why
and they're saying since we have over 100% coverage anyway, cell phone, because seriously, if it's too hard to do the national ID system as the delivery mechanism, then give it to But I mean,
give it to somebody.
It's just that we're not setting it up to do it. I agree.
Yeah, like in Malaysia, as an example, you get subsidized fuel. It is linked to an app, so you go to your gas station and then you scan the app, and then you get your subsidized fuel. For some reason, with all our promises of digitization, something falls through the cracks or by the wayside at some point, and maybe that's for the private sector to figure out.
Well, I mean, whether it is, the point is, kung walang kita, they're not interested. And kung mahirap, hindi gagawin ng gobyerno. Oh, ayan, patay. You either have to make money or it has to be easy. Reminds me, I mean, Kennedy said in 1963, we go to the moon not because it's easy, but because it's hard, and then all the other reasons. While I joke, I saw a poster. We did it not because it was easy, but because we thought it was easy.
Okay. Thank you for those perspectives. I'm glad that we also did a quick touch on digitalization. I'll move on to the next question from GMA, Gerard de la Peña. How
Okay.
will the exit of the UAE from OPEC impact us here in the Philippines? How do you view the depreciation of the peso to 61 pesos to a dollar level?
Okay, first on the 61 pesos. Okay, when you look at the actual percentage surrounding error, and of all the emerging market countries, there's only one emerging market currency that's gone up, actually Iran's money. but it's hardly traded. Okay. But everybody else, number one for the worst performance in Asia is the Philippines, number two is Thailand, because it is inevitable. If you are completely exposed to imports and your imports in various sectors have gone up, so your terms of trade are worse. So you cannot do anything. Ganun ang buhay. You want to be that exposed, then when it turns that way, you will suffer. When it reverses the other way, you will benefit. Ganun lang. Because it's one thing if we were an outlier, everybody's moving. It's just a matter of degree. Now, on UAE, theoretically, it should lead to lower oil prices eventually because that's the whole point of a cartel. Basically, OPEC is like De Beers for diamonds. Basically, diamonds are expensive because De Beers basically limits the supply of diamonds so that the price doesn't go down. Our real estate developers generally try to, if they have some discipline, limit the release and development of new products so that the price will not go down. So the cartel has over time had cheating, had people coming in and out, has honorarium, so but it should mean there should be less discipline, and therefore when things normalize, prices should have a slight downward bias. But the UAE is not Venezuela, Saudi Arabia, or Iran. It's a big producer, but it's not one of the majors. So there should be a tangential effect. What they really want to do is they want to legalize selling more and basically not be limited by what the cartels them. Now, what could be the real problem? Does it lead to a de facto breakup of OPEC? Because one guy leaves, okay lang. If others saying, kung siya, he's selling 50% more oil than last year because he's not subject by the quota. Bakit ako hindi? And so then Saudi Arabia and everybody says, we'll shut down a little bit so you can sell more. And then that's the signal of UAE is not what it means in itself, but what it could foreshadow.
Bob, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah. So over the past few years, we've seen greater non-OPEC production, right? Whether it's U.S. shale oil, etc. So to Stevie's point, it widens sort of the unpredictability of the whole oil trading system, which could be good if it leads to lower prices, which could be bad if it becomes much more unpredictable, and then you add the geopolitical risk premia, etc. It just tells us we are in a more challenging environment insofar as energy is concerned for the foreseeable future, whether it is because the US's willingness to be the guarantor of free trade or the free flow of energy, all these ideas of Malacca Strait, which is not going to happen anyway. It sort of compounds the whole question of how do you build energy security in a world where things are less predictable. It's going to be the top question in the near future.
You basically have less exposure to the least predictable, which are hydrocarbons, which we're not doing. But other people started doing 15 years ago in Asia. But because we wanted not to sacrifice revenue, ayan.
Okay. Yeah, thank you for those insights. We have two more questions from the audience so far. So Dex is from Minette Navarrete of Kickstart Ventures. The threats and risks are clear, and any durable solution needs time to create and establish. But we don't have the time needed. What solutions might the private sector undertake to lengthen the country's food and energy runway?
Wala, tiis. Okay? Because you cannot import when nobody's selling. Manigas ka. My point is the time to do it is now, the long term, rather than, let's scramble and try to get more when more is not available. I'm sorry. I'm tired. I remember people told me before the question, what should we do in the short term? I said, stop thinking in the short term. That's what we should do in the short term and start executing and planning in the long term. Look, Japan, China, they all have 5-year plans, which are not motherhood statements. They're actual 5-year plans. 15 years ago, they decided in China, we are too uncompetitive to compete for fuel-injected cars, yet we want to be a leader. And so we're going to go straight to electric and make a bet. And many failed, A few succeeded, and now they're the world leaders. Okay, so they didn't plan that. Oh, what do we do in the short term? Everybody's buying foreign cars in China, and we're now become the #1 car market. No, they said let's have a 15-year plan to become dominant in electric industries. What did they say? The same thing. Our oil production of Sunuk and PetroChina and Sinopec are going down. So what are we going to do? Let's become the leaders in solar panels and wind turbines. Now, 90% of solar panels come from China, and about 70% of wind turbines, because they protect it in Europe, come from China as well. So you act in the long term so that the next time you are relatively insulated. But short term, how can you buy what's not for sale? What are you going to do? Send the Philippine Navy to the Strait of Hormuz and escort the oil tankers?
Okay.
Create urea when it doesn't exist?
So
Bob?
I'll be more optimistic than Stevie. First of all, Indo, you can get urea from Indo. The Prabowo said they have 1.5 million extra tons. The question is, what do you need to pay to get this stuff? Because Stevie is a market guy, right? He knows things will be available. The question is at what price do you have to pay, right? So what does Prabowo want? What does Indonesia want so that it says we'll give you some urea? What will China want? What will other countries want so they will say we will give urea? The answer might not be simply an economic price. It might be a political price. So that's the first thing. The second thing is to help our farmers. One of the things we know is when we talk about, okay, farmers can't plant because they don't have urea. So hopefully the farmers can plant something else. The problem is the technology and the availability of the farmer to plant something else is extremely limited. So something the government can do is tell a farmer, okay, you cannot plant rice because urea is too expensive. What else can you plant? That is something hope you can change that behavior. The only problem is we have farmers who are 57, 58, they're relatively advanced stage. Mahirap na sila i-retrain. Pero
and
if
not
we
in
can
the
move them
short
to an
term.
alternative crop.
Planting season's about to start. And
Yes, I
yet
know. So
your urea
that is the
is
challenge.
now more than double what it was 3 months ago, if you can get it. So the question was not what we should do in the long term. What should we do in the short term? And I said manigas ka, because there's nothing you can do in the short term. Your solutions, which I completely agree with, are not for this planting season.
Yeah, I think just get the farmers away from rice who you can. But, again, mahirap nga yan, pero you have to give them some hope. Otherwise, we
No, and I
face
tell
real
you, our
social
farmers
problems.
are in their 60s. Their children are OFWs. They're going to be trying to sell their land to make them condos.
Okay. Well, if there are no additional perspectives on the short-term solutions, I'll move on to the next question from Joey Gutierrez of Ascot. I guess it's also somewhat related to the idea of short-term solutions.
Okay.
Do you see tourism development, particularly international arrivals, as a meaningful source of foreign exchange to offset food and energy pressures?
What? Sorry, repeat that question.
Do you see tourism development, particularly international arrivals, as a
Arrivals
meaningful
of what?
source?
Of people, of goods?
Yeah, I'm assuming this is referring to arrival of tourists.
Have you
Kasi that's
seen
what
what
tourism
our
development.
tourism, even before the crisis, was compared to our neighbors? Cambodia beats us. We're not even trying to compete anymore with Vietnam or Malaysia or Thailand. Cambodia beats us.
Yeah, the short, painful reality is if you want a meaningful increase in tourism, you have to get the Asians here, which is the Chinese. Okay, that is the short, painful answer. You have to get the Chinese here. You have to get the Koreans here.
The
Northeast
ones with
Asians basically.
money, the ones with population and money. That's it.
Yes.
You're
So the
not going to
question
get
is, what keeps
Western
them away?
backpackers who'll spend $10.
What keeps them away from what keeps a Chinese tourist or a Japanese tourist or a Korean tourist away from the Philippines is the question. And I think we know
Okay,
some
I'll
of those
answer
answers.
part of it. Never mind even the politics. You go to what I consider the platinum standard and the gold standard. The platinum standard is Japan. The gold standard is Thailand. They treat the tourist as a resource, not as someone to fleece. I mean, I've been in Japan where I asked direction. This mother in this parang the equivalent of a sari-sari store said, my daughter speaks English, let her show you. And they walked me like 3 blocks and wouldn't accept anything from me. And I felt so bad because I didn't buy anything from their store and everything. But they view it as we all gain when more of you come and spend money. Now, Thailand's not as good as that, but they're pretty good. And they anticipate needs. And in the Philippines, first of all, there's cost, there's efficiency, etc., etc. But in addition, even those who are not cheating tourists, we're very nosy and pakilamero. We don't understand in other cultures, it's actually not considered friendly. It's considered nosy. Like I remember I was queuing before Delta and we were checking in business class and they had to ask the security questions that you would ask when you check in. Okay, so I answered them. Did you pack this bag yourself? Yes. Has it been out of your sight? No. Then she goes, what did you eat for breakfast? I said, why are you asking me this? I said, I'm trying to be friendly. I said, there are 10 people waiting behind me. You're not my friend. Deal with the service. I mean, it's that kind of mentality versus they try to be friendly with good reason versus efficiency because all the person wants is to get finished with checking in or everything. They don't understand efficiency versus pakisama. But most important is safety, cost, and fleecing the customer. If you look, there's much less of that in Thailand, and there's practically none of that in Japan. So you treat the tourists as a resource and an asset, or you treat them as someone to make money off one time because he'll never come back again after he's been cheated.
So I think the short answer to Stevie's long story is no, we are not getting those tourists to save our economy anytime
Yeah,
soon.
and I mean, I'm actually being asked to speak to some people in Cebu about it. I said, if we cannot do it national as a kind of association, make it at least that area considered a safe area where you feel you're not cheated. I mean, I don't know how many countries I won't go to unless I'm with someone local because I think I'm going to be cheated. And I'm sure everybody who comes here who's not local feels the same way.
Hey, Bob, do you want to add anything in terms of solution-wise
On that happy
also?
note,
So,
Yeah.
yeah,
Uh,
mahirap talaga. It's really difficult because our tourism infrastructure is fragmented, right? It is difficult. Like, if you want to go to Siargao right now, you're a foreign tourist, you have to fly into Manila, get to Clark, go from Clark, go to Siargao, or to get to somewhere else. Now, maybe that is a function of infrastructure constraints, pero it's unlike Thailand, right? You can go into Bangkok, enjoy Bangkok, go somewhere else. When many people talk about coming to the Philippines, they say skip Manila, go to the beaches, etc. But getting to the beaches takes time and effort. So there is some hard infrastructure truth to it. There's also some stuff that, as Stevie says, is about security, safety, convenience, ease of being a tourist. Kung may ease of doing business tayo sa kumpanya, meron rin ease of being a tourist. And I think ease of being a tourist ranks relatively low in the Philippines, even though, if you go to Thailand or China, language is difficult. But here the problem is if you have a problem to solve, if you need to get somewhere, the sense that you can do it and solve it quickly is relatively low. And Stevie's traveled a lot. I've traveled a lot. That's one of the big challenges you have in the
and
Philippines
I'm
right now.
telling you, with technology, even ease of language is becoming less and less important. I remember I was brought by a client to this 4-star hotel in Nha Trang in Vietnam because he wanted me to sell it. And he said afterwards, 4-star wasn't that good. In the end, he decided not to sell it. But he said, this is like 2 years ago. And he said, you want a massage? Of course, I'll have a massage. Fine. Okay, so I had a massage. The massagista could only speak Vietnamese. So when I wanted to turn over, what did she do? She put in Google Translate, turn around. So showed it to me. What did I do? I turned around. You don't have to
Yeah.
speak English anymore.
Yeah, so nag-iiba na nga yung competitive advantage,
Exactly.
which is also the same with manufacturing and everything. So yeah, so it is going to be a challenge, and there are smart people in the Philippines who try to do it, right? So many of them are members of MBC. The challenge really, I think, is coordinating it with the government and doing all the right things at the right time and getting the message out and then being consistent with that message once we send it out. The problem is maraming beses sa Philippines, one thing collapses where, we're not consistent with the delivery mechanism, with the messaging, and finally with following through for the longest time, which is a problem everywhere in many sectors that we have.
Okay. Yeah, thank you for those comprehensive insights touching on tourism. I guess before I go to what was the final question, I'd like to ask Ms. Riza Mantarang if you have any questions for our
Yeah.
panelists. I know they've been waiting to also
Speak up,
hear from you.
Risa.
Or
You
maybe
were
a
very
comment.
eloquent in Banker After
Yeah.
Dark, which will come out soon. So I have high expectations for your question.
You already said so many things. Okay.
I'm teasing
If
you
you were
lang.
to predict, if you were to predict when the Iran war would end, what would be your predictions, like Stevie and Bob?
Okay, Bob, you want to go first or me naman?
Okay, so the problem with predictions is tatlo yan, di ba? When they say it is ending, when it actually ends, and when people perceive it actually ends, right? And the problem with the Iran war is it is part of a bigger Middle East situation, right? This did not start this year. It started years ago, decades ago, etc. So the question of when does I think it's not so much when does the war end. The question is when does the uncertainty end? And the problem is the uncertainty will not end because even if this next week, few weeks, both combatants say, okay, we stop fighting, right? Do you believe that the underlying issues have been solved? No. So there's always going to be that question of when will it restart, right? What triggers another round of fighting? When does the incentive exist for both sides to again, or one side to start the fighting? So yung geopolitical price premium, hindi mawawala. It's not going to disappear from the oil markets, from commodity markets, insurance, shipping, etc. So the whole cascade of costs will still be felt by us, even if they tell us it stops, until we get those three things aligned. The participants say they stop, the conflict really stops, and maybe to a certain extent there's some sense of stability in whatever arrangement comes out of it. And finally, perception is aligns with all those three. And given the unpredictability of everything, this is our base case. You will probably get fits and starts for the next few months at least. Fits and starts of some things will stop, then there will be threats and etc. So, but if you're pointing a gun to my head and telling me when will it stop, it has to stop before we get serious into tourist driving season in the US, because that will hurt politics in the US more perceptibly. So it has to stop within the next 4 to 6 weeks. Just on the nominal terms, right? Not on the real terms.
I agree with you, and let me say bizarrely something more optimistic, even though it's not for an optimistic reason. No, first, I don't think things will return to cheap prices until next year, number one, even if it ends tomorrow because of all the pileups and everything Bob has said. But what makes me think it is possible that it will end soon? And then the recovery period starts slowly in fits and starts. Everything you said, I agree with Bob. And then this is not an original insight of mine. It's something I listened to. And I forgot, I'm trying to remember the name, but anyway, China will make it end. Because China will talk to Iran and say, look, I am the importer of nearly 100% of your oil because I don't care about US and Western sanctions. So I've been buying most of the oil of Russia and most of the oil of Iran. So sanctioned oil, China says, I'll buy it. Go screw yourself, US, if you want to stop me. No? But now they're not getting their oil. And even though they have the stockpile, they're not going to say, I'm going to put myself now, what I did to the US on magnets and all these high-tech things which are necessary, they're going to do to us. So the feeling is over the next month, China will force a compromise, not because they love Iran or the US, but because they love themselves and have the leverage.
Yeah.
I hope it's true.
Your question is very interesting because, just like during the Cuban Missile Crisis, right, where everyone went to the brink and everyone basically divulged at the end what their strategic priorities were. This crisis, to a certain extent, will reveal strategic priorities.
Okay.
It's extremely interesting from the geopolitical point of view in that regard, right? Parang maximalist negotiating positions, but what will they accept and why they accept that?
No,
It will be very enlightening
no, and
for
also
people
I
for the
think
next few years.
Trump is learning. If you look at who Trump's heroes were, and this is self-proclaimed, it's Richard Nixon and Adolf Hitler, because he even hired Roy Cohn, the lawyer of Nixon, to be his lawyer until Roy Cohn passed away. And one of the things Nixon did in Vietnam and other places, what they call the madman theory. You better pacify him because he's so crazy, you don't know what he'll do. And everybody said, till they found an even greater madman. And he's being out madmaned by Iran because they're not just posturing, they really believe. Okay, and this is existential for them. Let me close with a story from Aesop's fables. The fox and the rabbit. The rabbit is running away from the fox. Okay, why in the story does the rabbit outrun the fox, even though the fox is a bigger and swifter creature? Because the fox is running for his dinner and the rabbit is running for his life.
Mhm.
The US wants dinner, it's Iran's life.
So since Stevie closed with an anecdote, I will close with my own anecdote. I'm a political risk analyst. I have analyzed the elections in 2004, 2010, 2016, 2022. And these I will tell you, without fail, if you take a look at all my predictions 1 year before the elections, they were all wrong. Every guy I said would win lost. Human nature is difficult. People's incentives are difficult to figure out. So there are different actors here. Highly centralized in the case of the US, highly diversified in the case of Iran. And then you have all these players in the region, from Saudi to Israel to the Gulf states, etc. And then you have China, you have Russia. It is an extremely complicated pot, right, of actors. So I think for us, we try to predict things, but what emerges and what they reveal about people, about players, is going to be very interesting at the end of the day.
Mhm.
Okay, Mr. Yu, do you have any comments, final comments to those answers?
I think, yeah, very good insights from both of them.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Bob and Stevie, for those super comprehensive insights. I think we really went beyond the numbers as the event title is, and touched on different points and different areas from tourism to digital. So yeah, thank you for your time and for sharing your insights to MBC members and other participants. Before we end, we'd like to kindly ask everyone for another group photo, I guess a more complete photo of the participants. So please kindly turn on your cameras and smile, and my colleague will cue the photos.
We'll find out how few people are watching.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay,
Um.
be ready to show us your brightest smiles, everyone. Three, two, one. Okay, one more. Three, two, one. Back to
Okay.
you, Bettina.
Yeah, thank you very much. So that concludes the first installment of Makati Business Club Economic Briefing Series for 2026, Beyond the Numbers, Global Conflict, Local Consequences for the Philippines. Yeah, thank you to our speakers again, and we'd like to hear your thoughts about today's event. Please share your comments and feedback by scanning the QR code displayed on the screen or the link sent to the chat box. And stay up to date with MBC's latest events and advocacies by following us on social media. We also have an economic dashboard. The economic dashboard provides executives and policymakers handy access to key economic data on the Philippines and its neighbors. It is updated real time when data becomes available on MBC's website. We also look forward to seeing you in our future events, we have an upcoming event with MBC Global Ideas Committee on the STT Makati Data Center Tour on May 21, Thursday from 10 a.m. to 1 p.m. at STT Makati. Yeah, that's it.
Okay, thank
We hope you
you.
have a good rest of the day, and thank you very much to Stevie, Bob again, and for our board trustee, Miss Riza also. Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye.